Well, good evening, and welcome back. At least a good place to get out of the heat. And Caleb, I'll remind you, I do have a PowerPoint. You get okay, all right. I want to make sure. We want to throw my audio-video guy off since I don't normally have a audio-visual presentation in the evening, but I do have one for tonight. And since this past Friday was the 4th of July weekend, and I wanted to be able to present a very much different history lesson, presented from America's past, a story that you may have heard, maybe have never heard before. But tonight we'll kind of fill in the blanks, or as Paul Harvey would say, read the rest of the story. Because I don't know about you, but the older I get, the more I see and start to understand more really what is going on in the world and in our life. And along with that, the more I see that surprises me or may not surprise me. Maybe you are thinking the same thing. In fact, one of our recent preachers' breakfasts, Harold McCrae, as many of you know, a longtime minister and a retired preacher from the Northwest congregation, said that he can't believe all that he has seen, what's going on and what's happening over these past few years. What's going on? And I tend to agree with him. But on a small bright side, there was a bit of good news discussed at the table concerning the Hobby Lobby case, if you are familiar with it, and the verdict that came down earlier this week from the Supreme Court. Put a little smile on most of our faces. It was a bit of good news with, I guess, with a sort of some skepticism, because if you noticed, it only passed by just one vote. It carried by a 5-4 ruling. And that shows, too, that there could be sudden change not too far off in our distant future. It's very important appointments like those to the Supreme Court, as we know, that is ahead for a president who will get to choose them. But as we observe this other Independence Day, 238th, doesn't seem very special when we all there's the momentums, the 200, 250, 300. We're all joking and looking at it. And I told the class that this morning, I said, well, I saw the 200 that I can, and come in 1976. And we were kind of tallying up the years. And I said, more than likely, if everything works well, and I don't guarantee myself anything, I more than likely will see 250. It's 12 years off or whatever. I said, but I don't know if I'll see 300. Because at the 300th anniversary of this country, I'll be 109 years old. I don't really plan on it. I don't really circle it on the calendar. I don't have any expectations. The boys were joking that more than likely, if they're healthy enough, that they will see the 300th anniversary celebration. And won't that be exciting? But as we observe this Independence Day and weekend, there's something else we also hear around this time in these days. And it's not just having the separation from God in our life and society as a whole. But we're being told that is how it was set up from the very beginning. We always hear separation of church and state, and you heard that phrase, and we'll talk briefly about that as well. But there are some that are still suggesting and tell us that even our founding fathers never had any faith at all. Have you heard that before? I know I have. Or so they claim. And that's kind of what I want to take them to task and review a little bit this evening, since it's the Independence weekend. I thought it'd be worthwhile looking at maybe a little bit closer into this again with maybe some facts of the past. In spite of us just hearing over and over again that the founding fathers of this great nation did not have faith. In fact, they have been atheists for the most part. I've even heard that. I know I have heard that throughout my lifetime. I am told instead to believe that they were mostly unbelievers who came up with this system of government that we have now. And I guess they want us to believe that so we can possibly identify with most of them today and the politics of the day, and certainly not having any type of Christian viewpoint or a Christian viewpoint that would be readily accessible. And I use Christian as those who profess and claim the name of Christ. We start out with what most of us understand is probably the media bias. I guess the LA Times, for example, said this: the founding fathers were deists who rejected the deity of Jesus. So he wasn't a savior. He was not the Son of God. And so they say, just with that alone, our founding fathers just rejected the deity of Christ. The bigger question that we'll look at is, who were these founding fathers? Because without much fact-finding, most believe what we're kind of told, what we possibly read. We do have a little bit of skepticism that is circulating with jokes, is that, everything on the internet, you believe everything on the internet and everybody laughs. Wikipedia, for example, which is supposed to be a source, is not a reliable source that even at high school level or even college universities will accept as any authorization that you could use as fact-finding. So you got to kind of do a little bit other homework than that, because you have to have some reserved skepticism when you go on the internet. But we must start to see that there are definitely people, even today, with agendas, and maybe even hidden agendas. You can find several articles from East Coast publications, which, by the way, and not putting down any of our publications here in the Midwest, we kind of recirculate, if you'll kind of see where the original source comes from, and reprinted here in the Midwest, oftentimes as well. And they say things like the authors of the Declaration of Independence were enemies of Christ. Or like Professor Stephen Morris, who said, I quote, "The founding fathers were not Christians. I don't care what anyone says." Isn't that nice? Just don't confuse me with any facts. I don't care what you find. They just didn't do it. I won't accept that. Well, where does he get his facts that will support his position? Or does he need any? So newspapers and college professors of the academia world are all weighing in every day. And that brings me to our story and this most famous portrait, especially down this time of the year. I'm sure you've seen this before. It's in all our textbooks, all of our history lessons. I'm sure you have. I don't think I'm surprising any of you with this portrait. This is the 4th of July, remember, and the signing of the Declaration of Independence. Most of you have seen this all your life. But I want to know about the who's in this portrait that are never described in any detail. It's kind of like they're just kind of in the background almost. We look at this portrait as a what? It's the signing of the Declaration of Independence. We don't look at it as a who. We don't look at it as a who's who. It's more of a what. So when you see this, I'm going to ask the who question. Who do you see? Who's in there? Can you pick out anyone out, notably, in this portrait? Well, most of you will probably nod a little bit. The most common given answer is the ones you probably remember in the photo, this portrait, rather. The two, mainly two, Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin. If you start counting the heads in there, isn't there a little bit more than these two individuals? We often pick them out and kind of discard the rest. History has done the same thing. As I've had conversations with my sons, when you learn this portrait and when you learn about history, who's mainly talked about? Who else is in this most famous portrait? See, we remember the event so much, a remembrance of our Declaration of Independence. But if the portrait could speak anything else, could it, with those who also signed their lives with it? Because if you remember, signing the Declaration was going to be a rebellion against the British colonies, the armies. The whole thing is that we are separating from you. And it really is a death wish. I'm marking my name on this. You can track me down. I'm not going to be in a hidden, a silent majority. I'm signing this. And with that, many, if you look on the tracks of what the British ended up doing to many of them. These noble dressed all men standing and signing, does the average American even recognize anyone else? Or should we? Should we even care? Do they even count on it? Or only see these two men who we know? Or do we know the rest of the story? Have you been told about anyone else? Or do we even consider them just kind of like I said, just taking up space? They're kind of extras, kind of like a crowd would be if you did a city scene and you just had people walking on the streets. Are they not important enough? Do they not have a story to tell? I would like to ask, how is it that we get taught that the founding fathers did not have faith? Where does that come from? Because in reality, there was a total of 56 signers, if you know that much. That's more than the two. 56, that's a pretty good majority of kind of a melting pot of a lot of different minds and a lot of different thinkers. That's a good number of people who are in agreement for one such document. We also may recognize that not so much in the painting, but maybe the biggest signature found on the document, where we get the phrase, well, just sign your John Hancock. We understand that we may not visually recognize him by a portrait, but we recognize that famous signature. It was the loudest, the biggest, the boldest, and that's why people still use it today by saying, just sign your John Hancock. We are almost deliberately taught, I think, to only look at the most often quoted, by the way, the most two least religious of all of the group of the 56 that signed it. Two is not a majority, might I add. Discount all the rest and hold on to the two. But this makes our rule and an exception not to talk about the rest, and I'll explain why in a minute, of why I believe such. I want you to listen and tell anyone else that wants to discuss anything about our forefathers in the future these facts. Did you know that 29 of the signers of the 56 had seminary degrees? Of course, in the religious world, many that want to become a minister or a preacher of their faith has to go to seminary. It's religious school. It's basically your 4 years of education, of just in seminary. And we have 29 of those signers who had seminary degrees. That's Bible study, about the Scriptures, knowing who Jesus was, and that he was the Son of God. When those of any particular notion want to be a preacher, even today, you still go to seminary. And 29 of the 56 were such. By the way, Jefferson and Franklin, by the way, did not have a seminary degree. Is it a coincidence that we learn about the non-religious individuals and certainly leave out the religious ones? One of the signers that I'll bring up tonight is this man, Jonathan Witherspoon. He's had over a dozen published volumes of gospel sermons. And not the kind that you'd write and kind of sit there and sit on the shelf and then go on sale and then go off 50% and then 75%. No, in his day, they were considered bestsellers. Couldn't keep him on the shelves when he wrote any of his gospel sermons. People could not wait for the next one to be published. He was the president of Princeton University. He served on over 100 committees in Congress. I would say that he's pretty much involved in our government. Why don't we hear more about Jonathan Witherspoon in secular history? Well, I may suggest this. Why? Because in 1791, he created the first family Bible study. A signer of our Declaration of Independence. And several quotations are attributed to him, and I picked this one out because that's probably why you don't hear Jonathan Witherspoon, because of this quote. He said, "I entreat you in the most earnest manner to believe in Jesus Christ, because there is no salvation in any other." Does that say that he doesn't believe in the deity of Jesus Christ? Well, Jonathan Witherspoon believed he was and wanted everybody else to know it. That quote alone would preach today. This coming once again from one of our great so-called atheist founding fathers. Sound like any of our politicians today? Absolutely not. If one of them was to come out and quote this, do you know how browbeat he would get in the media? Of the separation of church and state. How dare he even say a statement like that? How many he would offend? Instead, we hear he can't say that. A politician isn't allowed to say that or even imply that he knows that. Because, and we'll bring up the separation of church and state. The phrase separation of church and state itself does not appear in the United States Constitution. So when they say, they're always quoting this, it's not in the Constitution. But the First Amendment does state this, that Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Is that pretty simple? I can understand that. By quoting this statement that Congress shall not what? Get in the church business. They're not. Not setting up one, or on the other end, prohibiting one. That's it. That was really to protect the church, not to protect a nation that was founded on godly principles. But in the early stages of our country, before the Constitution, There's another story. There were ministers and preachers that had major influence. That's such a shame today. Do our ministers have influence today? I mean, in such a way that it could be revolutionary? Or do a lot of our preachers ride the fence because they're afraid of offending someone, or I can't say that, or that may be deemed as hate speech? They boldly came up and proclaimed a lot of what was going wrong in the nation. And their influence was strong, and I'll get to the notion here in a while. I want you to know that let's first talk about the royal minister, or reverends at that time, as they were called in that day, and how it played in the setting up of our country. John Adams, second president of the United States, was asked in 1816. They wanted to know from his perspective. Many of you watched maybe the HBO series on John Adams that they had. One of the biggest founding fathers, of this time frame. And they asked him his perspective, not some opinion from a media source, not from someone else. In his opinion, a guy who was there from the beginning, what individuals were most responsible for our independence? And a president who was there during the time from the beginning to end, who would say Franklin, Jefferson, himself. No, instead he mentioned the following: Reverend Dr. Samuel Cooper, Reverend Jonathan Mayhew, and Reverend George Whitefield. Now, why were these ministers mentioned by John Adams? Well, they were considered revolutionists who played a vital role in our independence. And yes, their profession were ministers. Again, most wouldn't believe that ministers played a role like that in our independence, and yet one of our very own presidents, quoting John Adams, said that it was so. In reality, the British knew about them as well. In fact, felt their presence and saw them as a bona fide threat. Back then, the British actually had a name for them. They named preachers and ministers the Black Robe Regiment. Most of them wore the black robes, as you kind of see maybe on movies and stuff. And they treated them hostile. And get this, they saw them as a military threat. I often wondered, and we're going to get to this, but they burn churches after churches. They say, that's just so malicious. The British are so just downright evil. Why would you even burn churches? Not if it was a military threat. Unlike, we had to learn the lesson in Vietnam, trusting small children or even dogs, because they knew military men would go to a dog and it was a booby trap. It was a bomb. Or a small child in a shoe shine box. It was the same kind of thing wrapped up in something that they saw as a military threat. And the British said and believed if it weren't for preachers in America, it would still be a happy British colony. That was their thought at the time. That's why the British did burn so many churches. Church after church. Wherever they went. It looks cold and heartless, but to them it was a military threat. So they went to New York City, where there was a total of 19 churches that was there to try to silence the message. In fact, they burned 10 to the ground. They followed up by burning churches in New Jersey, in Virginia, and even though you count the casualties, we as Americans lost 4,300 to British bullets, 11,500 were taken as prisoners of war, and if you were a captive minister or reverend, you might as well forget it, because the British specifically blamed preachers for starting the revolution. I ask you today what power that they had, what kind of influence that they had in a church. And as I asked even myself, can that be said of ministers today? What a tragic difference in 2014 as we just try to struggle to fit in, so not to disrupt anything, to not turn over the apple cart. They had preached from the pulpit prior to 1763. And what we find they preached, we find those rights that we speak of today. Many of them have preached in the pulpit that all men are created equal. In fact, we are told or made to think that God wasn't in the Constitution at all, or the intent of those men and forefathers. No one said we are to believe were written by secular men who didn't write this with having God in mind at all, or the fact without God, without the Word. And as I mentioned, 29 of the 56 signers of the Declaration of Independence had seminary degrees. Let me bring up another signer. Frederick Augustus Muhlenberg. I didn't remember him. I didn't remember a history teacher ever talking to me about this. Many do not. He actually signed the bottom of the First Amendment, the Constitution. So if many of us don't know who he is, who was he? Well, the Reverend Frederick Augustus Muhlenberg, who also had a minister brother who was a minister in New York in 1777. And when the British came in and burned those 10 churches that I mentioned earlier to the ground, I mentioned he looked around with horror and watched what happened and said, there should be something done about this. Got to make this right. He made an appointment to stand up, to be heard. He'd be more involved from that point on in this cause to do something more about it. And later he did just that, and helped write the original Constitution for the state of New York. And after that was elected to Congress, and eventually Speaker of the House, all being that minister, mind you, of how he got started. Anyone today would be shamed and unheard of having a minister serve today. It just can't happen. Not in this nation. That separation has to put a divide between. He is over the writing of the First Amendment, as I said, because he signs the bottom of it, with our rights as Christians, as also, at this time, Speaker of the House when this gets voted in. So you tell me. If we are supposed to understand the separation of church and state, and he's not supposed to be there, why would he even bring it up and even sign it, and as Speaker of the House? He would not. So with the information, I am to now believe that he is writing the very document that would outlaw him, so he could not be or would not be involved any longer. I think we've got the story wrong. By hearing that phrase, separation of church and state. Is that what he intended in signing his very own name at the bottom of that document? No, he wrote it so he and anyone else would be protected. How about Charles Thompson? For those who have been in the church for any length of time, you may start to recognize his last name. If you sound familiar, ever heard of the Thompson Study Bible? You may have it in your house. You may have it in your home. Maybe, or just the Thompson Bible. Again, one of the 56 signers, and one of only 2 signers that signed on the 4th of July. The rest signed on August 2nd. The Thompson Bible we can still get today. He even made a synoptic gospel where he put in all the writings in chronological order. A studier of the Bible, you think? And you just kind of sort of knew it. And not only was a signer, but a theologian. And I saved the best for last because after hearing this man's resume, history would certainly have to remember him. And yet, you probably never heard his name shouted from the media sources much, especially even during this time. His name, Benjamin Rush. Ring any bells to you? Do you know his bio? He really almost should be on Mount Rushmore. I don't want to put down I know Teddy Roosevelt was the acting president during that time, but you always wonder, you see Jefferson, you see Lincoln, you see Washington, and you see, no offense to anybody that loved the Rough Rider, but, really, he's up there. Upon his death in 1813, from some of the signers still living, John Adams said this about Benjamin Rush. The 3 most notable founding fathers were George Washington, Ben Franklin, and Benjamin Rush. So then why don't we hear about him today? What's the big deal? I wondered what's behind his story that he has to be ostracized once again from the media of today. See, he is the father of public schools under the Constitution, father of our contemporary education that still runs today. He started 5 universities. 3 are still active today. He wrote the first chemistry test book in the United States. He wrote the first psychiatry textbook in the United States and the first abolition movement. He is called the father of American medicine. And during his time, some 3,000 medical students had his signature on their diplomas. He trained the first black physician. He served as professor of medicine at 3 different universities all at the same time, and you think you have a busy schedule. Was even acting Surgeon General. Served with and under 3 presidential administrations with the director of the U.S. Mint, which started the first College of Physicians, the signer to ratify the Constitution. That's just some of his bio. So why, after hearing all of this, why is he not remembered? Why isn't he at least put up in there in that portrait that we remember and not put up on that pedestal? Maybe that's why we've not heard of Benjamin Rush, because like I said, if you had seen this guy and did not much would not hear more about. And why we don't, because I believe we don't. He also started the Sunday school movement in the United States. So we can't put someone up there that has done that because of our separation, of course. So if you ever enjoyed coming to a Sunday morning Bible class here in the United States, I guess you'll have to thank him. We don't hear about him because he would not be one of our atheist founding fathers, if anyone knew that. Also, by the way, he also started the first Bible Society. Why? Because he wanted a strong, healthy America. He thought two things would happen if everyone would just read and apply the Bible. And I think you can kind of come to the same summation he did. If you could get 350 plus million people in this country to not only read their Bible, but apply it to their daily lives, what kind of America would we live in? See, he understood that it would still be in effect to number one today. People would become Christians, number one. And number two, if obeyed, it would have as many less social problems that we see in the world today, just by following those examples. And all of this coming from the so-called atheist influences to our independence and Constitution. So in closing, as we reflect this past weekend for most of today, and I know many of you don't see it this way as an extra day off. I told you how much that most, and I remember in the work schedule, you hated when 4th of July landed on a Wednesday because you had to go back to work the next day. You loved it when it landed on a Friday because it was a 3-day weekend. And here at Fort Sill, they call it a training holiday, and they extend it out to sometimes 3 and sometimes 4. Boy, aren't we lucky. We always like that. So it's just a day off, or maybe a couple of days off, or a day at the lake, or a picnic. And maybe it was hot dogs and apple pie and fireworks and everything else that goes along with America. But how many miss the other story that I said tonight? Because so many more have forgotten our true roots. And I thought this would be a good time to remember our history, our true history, without any hidden agendas. So now you know a little bit more of what we would say is the rest of the story, and there are others that we could talk about the other signers who, without them doing what they did and stood up for what they stood for, what they thought was right, we wouldn't have America today. So today we can worship this day as we did on this first day of the week in spirit and in truth, without fear of retaliation or especially government intervention. If we hold these people to our history, not revisionists, not trying to slant it any other way, just factual stuff that you can look up just like I had for this evening. But thanks to the silent heroes as well, the signers upon that wall in the portrait that we didn't know about, that had a major influence and impact other than the two that we do know about. And I know it didn't quote much Bible in that with today's lesson, but with this weekend I thought it was important to be the other voice from so many other voices that have been shouting the opposite and what we were truly founded on. I hope that's given you some kind of revitalized just enthusiasm to know that we weren't so far off the track after all when they said that we were. We also set a time aside that if we can be an encouragement to you, to pray with you and for you. Maybe you have something going on in your life that you just need extra prayers. Maybe you never obeyed the gospel. We don't want an opportunity to go unnoticed, to have that available to you as well. Whatever your need is, if you have one, if you'll come now and make it known as we stand, as we sing.